Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and this is the survival guide to a dark age of the mind. So I'm going through this series and we're discussing how we know if we live in a dark age and what to do about it. If we do in fact live in a dark age, and not a dark age of technology, not a dark age of healthcare or of a worldwide war, but a dark age of the mind. A failure to have knowledge. In fact, here's how bad it is: a failure to even use the word knowledge correctly. Now, interestingly, this is something that Confucius spoke about. He lived during the Warring States period when China had gone from an empire and broken up into civil war. And one of the reasons he said this happened is because the names were no longer being used correctly. Justice, righteousness were being used to name things that were actually unjust. And so he spoke about what is needed is the rectification of the names, calling just, righteous, righteous, and not confusing justice with injustice. And we seem to be in a similar place. We need to use the word knowledge correctly. I wrote about this and about Confucius in my book, The Natural Moral Law. I talk about that same problem and the need to know what is good. And how do we know what is good? Using the word good correctly. And now we're on to a dark age where we don't even know what is good or what is knowledge. And so I spoke about some of that in the last one. Today, what I want to look at is how we get knowledge. Let me transfer us over to my notes here. We want knowledge, and we won't stop until we get it. So what we're going to be learning is this. We get knowledge through reason and argument. If you know, then you need a sound argument. All right. So that's going to be sort of our working premise. You may have some doubts about that, and some of those doubts I already addressed in the first video, and others I'll catch as we're going. Because one of the things that happens in a dark age is that people reinterpret the word know to mean something other than needing a sound argument. And so knowledge ends up being, in a dark age, knowledge ends up meaning when you don't know, right? When you don't have a sound argument, you are said to know by some philosophers today. You properly believe in the basic sense and you're warranted to do so. Now, of course, when they're asked about why they believe that, they have to try to give a sound argument. So they don't even live according to the principles they lay out. Do as they do, attempt to give arguments to explain their views, not as they say, is the opposite. You don't need arguments, right? So all kinds of attempts to get around the fact that when you know, just review from last time, you have a belief, and the one we're going to spend a lot of time on is this: God is real. It is a true belief. Now, at that point, you might still just have an opinion. You could have opinions that are true and they're just on accident. You got it right. So that's what makes this the next step, is that you can show it is true with a sound argument. And I got to say sound argument because people have all kinds of unsound arguments. And that's one of the things I want to start with today is avoiding fallacies. We'll have a whole video on fallacies. But a fallacy is an argument that does not support the conclusion. And many of the going arguments for God's existence are fallacious. So they'll say something like this. Remembering, keep this in mind for our whole video series. God means a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging in being, wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, and truth. That's what's meant by God. So when you're arguing for God's existence, you're arguing for this. You're not arguing for Zeus. You're not arguing for a higher power alone, an ultimate being itself. This. This is from Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 4, and it's just called theism. So you don't want a fallacious argument. And here's how a fallacious argument works. Everyone knows God. And say, really? Everyone has this belief? I mean, I'm pretty sure I can prove that wrong by going outside and talking to people, and they don't believe that. Okay, no, that's not. I mean, everyone has a sense of the divine. Well, how would you have a sense of this? You can't sense the infinite. Your senses are always limited. Or the eternal, you're sensing something right now. You can't sense when it had no beginning. Okay, well, not that. Everyone has a sense of an ultimate being. Well, still the same problem. How do you sense what is ultimate? You'd always be sensing something that is limited, not ultimate. Okay, everyone, and they'll just keep going with the same mistake in different ways, right? Everyone has a sense that there is something higher. Sure, I mean, the IRS is higher, gravity is higher power than me. So yeah, everyone knows there's some higher powers. That doesn't get us to this, does it? So that's what is called an overextension. And most of the arguments that are given today that I hear, the supposed theistic arguments, are overextensions. And that means that they don't support their conclusion. It's like it's like this, an example. Some apples are red, therefore all apples are red. That's an overextension. No, all you know is that some apples are red. All you know is there's a higher power from this sense, supposedly. You can make a case that you don't even get that. You don't get to hear. You're going to need more arguments. So here's what often happens. Someone gives a fallacious argument. It is pointed out as fallacious, and they conclude, we don't need arguments anyway. And they become like a fee. It's just a 30. You already know it. I don't have to prove it. They attempted to, failed, and then they say that like sour grapes. Fine, we don't need arguments. What we should do, learn to give sound arguments, which is what we're doing together. And how are we going to do that? In order to explain this, let me give you a brief history here. I mentioned this a little bit in video 1, but I want to talk about Plato's understanding of knowledge. Plato said, knowledge is of the eternal, unchanging forms. We don't ever see those in this life. We saw these as disembodied spirits, which incidentally had no beginning. And we got put into the body and forgot. Then when we remember, we know. So knowledge is remembering when you saw these eternal forms. But knowledge is about what is eternal and unchanging. So two things. His story here, I think, is false. But he's right about this. Knowledge is about what is eternal and unchanging. If you know something, or you say, I know this, and it changes, then you don't know it anymore. Let's take a sports example. You say, I know who won the Super Bowl. It was the Patriots. You have to give a year, because every single year there's a new one. Patriots might do it a lot, but other teams win sometimes. The Chiefs win. So you have to say, I'm going to pick you, I'll probably be wrong about when the Patriots won. In 2015, the Patriots won the Super Bowl. I don't know. And what if that changed, though? Like somehow even that year changed. So 2015, the Broncos won, and then it switches, Green Bay won, and then it switches. Well, you couldn't say you have knowledge. So you have knowledge of what is eternal and unchanging in contrast to what changes and is temporal. This knowledge comes first and is what makes sense of the temporal and changing. All right. So we'll consider later the Platonic explanation of the material world and our soul. That's different than what he just said here about knowledge, what we want. It's like he set up this thing, we want this, but then he fails to get it. And he gives a totally false story about matter and the soul getting stuffed into matter and wanting to get back out of matter. Now, fast forward to Locke. Locke gets his place in epistemology by giving an explanation of how knowledge, or his word is understanding, essay concerning human understanding, is developed. Completely in contrast to Plato, who says the soul is without beginning. He says the soul has a beginning and is a blank slate. And then once you come into the world, experiences impress themselves on that blank mind. And this is where ideas come from. Now, he still wants to get to the same unchanging ideas. In fact, this is going to be one of the big problems for an empiricist. So he has an empiricist story. He goes from the particulars of experience to the unchanging. And this is overextension, we talked about above. I've seen 5 crows that are all black, therefore all crows are black. But then you meet an albino crow that's white. Not all crows are black. So experience doesn't get us to the unchanging. What he was giving was a developmental explanation, which is still helpful for a lot of things and has been refined in psychology down since his time. Was it he's died 1702, I believe, or 1725. I confuse him and Newton. So 3+ centuries of development of how we develop as humans in what we come to claim to know, the context of our understanding. But his empiricism gets in the way, just like Plato's story of the soul does. So what we have to do is say, they are correct in saying that we want to know what is unchanging, and our minds develop in a context, but we can use these insights to question Plato and Locke's own account of reality. So the third person, back to Aristotle. Specifically, Aristotle's logic. Like Plato, he tells us true things about knowing, but then his story of metaphysics is mistaken, and we'll argue for why. He thinks the material world has existed from eternity, and God is the pulling force, in the sense that the world tries to become perfect like God, but God's unaware of the world. And the soul and the body are one in a way that makes it seem like when the body's gone, the soul is too. The soul is the form of the body. So that's all of Aristotle's metaphysics. But Aristotle gives us logic. And he identifies the laws of thought. And logic is the science of inferences. If we know A and B, what else do we know? If we know that all men are mortal, and we know that Socrates is a man, what else do we know? So that's what logic studies. And what was coming to be called Aristotelian or classical logics is one of the things we're going to learn is the tools for how to make inferences. But logic presupposes thought and the laws of thought. These are identity. A is A. Excluded middle, either A or non-A, and non-contradiction, not both A and non-A. And those go together. We'll talk more about them in detail. I don't want that to be confusing because of A. What's A talking about? It's a variable. God is God. Everything is either God or it's not God. And nothing is both God and not God at the same time in the same respect. The care taken on the doctrine of Christ proves how important the law of non-contradiction is to Christians. He's not God and non-God at the same time, in the same respect. Two natures, human and divine, one person. So his human nature is God, divine nature is divine. So the laws of logic aren't so much beliefs as that by which we form any belief. Laws of thought. They're presupposed in thinking. And the goal of thinking is to make sense of, I'll just use this word, the world, as a broad sense of what is. Make sense of what is. To give meaning to. Meaning is more basic than truth. You can't know if something is true or false unless you know what it means. If I gave you a true or false test and the questions were meaningless to you, you couldn't answer them. I mean, you couldn't intentionally answer them, right? So we're going to learn about how to shed light in a dark age by coming to understand, by coming to have meaning and make sense of the world. A dark age can't make sense of the world. It can't even make sense of the word know. It can't make sense of the word God. And we want to know God. So we want to make sense of what is meant by God and therefore ourselves, knowing God and knowing ourselves. And in doing that, we'll easily survive a dark age of the mind. We'll thrive in a dark age of the mind by knowing God. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.